Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to this, our last and final webinar of 2017, which is how to write a great brief in half the time. Now, this is a re-record of our last session due to some technical difficulties, so apologies to anyone who was on that particular session and wasn't able to see the screen. However, we've done the rerun. This should be a lot smoother, and we're ready to go now as well. So, a quick introduction to me. My name is Eddie Rice. I'm one of the success managers here in I3 Digital. It's kind of my role to make sure that our customers get the best out of their products that they buy from us and the solutions. And we're also seen to be leaders in terms of where the market's going. So our customers kind of come to us with any issues that they have, and we help them with that as well. So some quick house rules. This is obviously a recorded session. So what I'll do is I'll just introduce you to our customer success manager and John Eaton, and then what I'll also do is just highlight our next webinar, which is on the 12th of January of 2018, which will be our very first one, and it's our view of the 2018 digital trends. So it'll be a very interesting webinar to take part in as well. If you'd like to sign up for that webinar, please contact our marketing guru, Keith, at i3digital.com, and he'll happily sign you up for that webinar as well. So, John, I'll just hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Cool, brilliant. So, my name's John Eaton. I am the head of digital strategy and sales at i3. So, I talk to all of our new customers who are thinking of coming on board with us, try and get an overall strategic view of what they're trying to achieve. I also work with a few of our other customers as well, so current customers, on evolving what they're trying to do online. Lots of digital transformation, digital disruption, and I've got quite a bit of experience with people who've been writing briefs, and I know how to get briefs written quickly and accurately.
Perfect, that's great, John. So what I'm going to do is just run through the agenda for the session. First and foremost, we're going to really define how you want to buy, which is obviously quite important. The next up, then, John's going to share some examples and some insight into shaping the working relationship. How do you want to manage that working relationship with your chosen agency? Doing this will allow you to make sure that it's a smooth running operation. How to avoid overscoping, which means that it's going to be less work for both you and for the chosen agency as well. It'll be much more focused on what you're actually looking for. We will then show examples of identifying and measuring project success. It's also quite important how you're going to gauge the success of the project and how to outline that as well. And then last but by no means least, John will be sharing his 5 top tips that all briefs need, which will allow you to save time. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to John now, who will be taking you through this webinar.
Thanks a lot, Eddie. That's great as an introduction. Cheers. So the first section I want to talk about is defining how you want to buy. And this is important because it makes a big difference to what you have to do as part of your pre-selection buying process. So there's 2 different ways we often see people wanting to engage with agencies. On the left-hand side here, you've got the traditional request for proposal or tender process, where you spend about 3 weeks putting together a document, and then suppliers spend about 3 weeks coming back to you with some responses. On the right-hand side, we've got the more informal discovery approach, where people go and have meetings with agencies or digital transformation partners and try to sort of understand the working relationship and also define the scope a bit further. Common misconception is that the right-hand side approach takes more time, but actually, in reality, that's completely wrong, I think. So, having worked in 2 big digital agencies and also partnered with other agencies on joint bids, and having the lucky perspective of being in a relationship with a client-side person, I know that the average tender response to a completely open tender is about 50 pages. And I also know that, on average, if you've got a decent project, you're going to receive at least 20 to 30 responses, which is going to take you at least 2 hours to go through each one, even if you're just giving it a cursory glance to qualify it out on the basis of cost. So, realistically, if you do go out to tender, although you might be thinking that you're saving yourself time, what you're actually doing is creating a lot of workload, because you're going to have to spend a lot of time reading responses before you can start to make any decisions. Conversely, a discovery session normally lasts about 3 hours with an agency. So if you meet 5 suppliers, it probably take about 15 hours of your time. And the best thing about that is that you won't be just sitting there reading. You're actually going to be learning things about your project, which potentially you can use, whether you decide to work with that supplier or not. And then the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is when you're asking suppliers to respond, thinking about the way you want them to do that. So there are 2 different ways you often see suppliers being invited in to talk about projects. The left-hand side there is the proposal approach, so getting someone to physically come back with some written information about how they're going to approach your project. And on the right-hand side, you've got the pitch approach, so someone turning up and talking about your business in front of your colleagues. The advantages of a proposal format is it's a good way of measuring accuracy and comparing suppliers on a sort of like-for-like basis. It's quite fair and open. The drawback, of course, is that suppliers can lie, and particularly on open tenders where you haven't given a tremendous amount of information, it's almost inevitable that someone will want the work more than anybody else and therefore completely over-egg their estimates or lie about what the final deliverable is going to be. You don't want that situation because when it comes to further down the line, you're going to have a real problem. If you look at the pitch situation, almost you've got the converse going on. So it's much easier to assess chemistry and to interrogate your suppliers to make sure that they're not lying. But the problem is that you can fall in love with the sort of idea of working with that supplier and forget to ask the same questions of each supplier. So you often have situations whereby you'll have met with 3 or 4 suppliers at the pitch stage, and you'll have asked somebody you don't like very much a particularly difficult question to qualify them out, but then you haven't asked the supplier that you like that question. And ultimately that means that then down the line there's a bit of a mismatch in expectations over the scope of work you're going to deliver. My recommendation would be to have a mixture of both proposal writing and pitches within any process in selecting a new supplier, because you want to measure accuracy, but also you want to measure the chemistry with the supplier and work out if the relationship's going to work for you. So the next bit I want to talk to you guys about was the working relationship. And particularly at the moment, there's a lot of movement within digital projects to work more agile. And that means different things to different people. But in simple terms, what it means is that you're sharing the responsibility over shaping scope much more with the digital supplier. So that means that often the budget needs to be a bit more fluid, the timeline and the scope needs to be obviously more fluid as well. And that's in contrast to the waterfall delivery, which we were used to sort of 3 or 4 years ago, where customers would come to us and say, we don't have capacity to do this project, we want to give it to you lock and stock, but we want a fixed budget and a fixed timeline to deliver the work that you have. Obviously, when you're working like that, as the agency, you're often having to deliver a lot more services than you might think is totally fair, so you're much more conscious about controlling budget and time. Whereas in an agile situation, you're often much more focused on delivering stuff that the users want. I don't think there's a particular advantage to either way of working, really. It depends on what you're trying to do. In fully transformational projects, agile can be really useful because it allows you the time through the project to constantly reassess what you're trying to achieve. But if you do want to work in either of these ways, it's really important that you tell the suppliers that you're talking to that this is your preference, because agile working in particular requires there to be working principles at play on both your side and also on the supplier side as well. So if there is a situation where you're working with a supplier who's way more agile than your organization is able to be, that might cause some problems internally for you. And equally, if you're a particularly agile organization and you want to have, weird and wonderful conversations through the project about how you're going to deliver lots of different user-focused success, then if you're talking to a supplier who's very much used to delivering exactly what was put out in the spec, you're going to have your expectations mismatched there as well. So the next area, which I think is possibly the largest area really, is how to avoid overscoping. And to do this, what I've done is I've highlighted across our own project initiation process, which allows us to get to a position where we can start building a project, the areas that I think clients can get involved in and the areas that they should definitely stay away from. So I think it's fair to say that if we get a brief that's got some competitor research and some focus group work done as part of that, it's always useful because it allows us to understand a bit about what the organisation is trying to achieve, and also it allows us to see that the organisation is actually engaged in what the stakeholder that we're talking to is trying to achieve as well. So this can be done, but I do think that it's important that this is done by somebody who has some training, or at least the ability to do things impartially. So I think it's totally not okay for someone to use a project like this just to try and force their own agenda. So I think it's just important to make sure that if you're doing that, you're going to do it impartially. Make sure that that works for you. In terms of the next area, we've got persona creation and user interviews and card sorting. This is stuff that you could do without talking to a digital supplier, but it's more than likely that if you do this work, that they're going to potentially challenge you and ask you to explain your rationale behind doing certain things. So prototyping, user testing, tech specification. This is the area that I would really suggest that clients stay away from, because if you do not know how your suppliers are going to run projects through their business, and you also do not know the technology that they're going to use, it's very difficult for you to do anything particularly intelligent that's actually going to work, because it might have to be completely redone to fit within the technology and test requirements of the supplier that you've chosen. So the next area I wanted to talk to you about is identifying and measuring success. And there's 3 different areas here. I think the days of organizations just looking at macro success factors seem to be going now, because there's so many different ways in which you can measure success, and also so many different contributing factors. So we're seeing a lot of organizations now talking to us about things like attributed lead contribution and that sort of thing. So I think it's important not just to look at increasing overall numbers, so generating 10% uplifts in sales, for example, but to look at what actually is important within that wider customer acquisition process that allows you to say comfortably that you're on the right lines. So tools like Lead Forensics are really useful for that, because they can show you that you've got users coming back to your site over a particular amount of time. And actually there are some new tools, Google Analytics, that do the same sort of thing. So their cohort analysis is really useful, showing you people who are browsing the site over a period of time. So particularly for organizations who have long sales cycles, think about what you can do in order to measure objectives that are more micro rather than macro as part of your digital project. The next area to think about is operational versus commercial. I think one of the things that I'm seeing more and more in digital disruption and transformation exercises is people not just looking at how they can increase their market share, but also looking at how they can improve the service to a level that makes it very difficult for their competitors to replicate. So on the left-hand side there, we've got an example of someone using a ticketing gun within a picking and packing process within an e-commerce business, and that could be really useful in terms of streamlining the order fulfillment process. So if you look at organizations like Amazon and more recently Next, a large part of their proposition to customers is the speed of delivery of services and products once you've actually bought something. So I think that's something to be aware of, is that if you can offer a great experience within delivery, that can make a massive difference to your repeat business and also the way you can disrupt a marketplace. Obviously, it's important on the right-hand side, if you are in e-commerce, to try and increase transaction value. But I think it's important just to try and keep those things separate, rather than just saying that you want to achieve something, large. Try and think about the steps that you might need to take in order to increase market share over the long term, rather than just the short term. And then finally in this area, I want to talk about channel shift and cannibalization of sales versus actual real growth. So at i3 we have obviously a few different tourism and tourist attraction clients, and we do get inquiries quite a lot from organizations in this sector. One of the common themes in 2017 from these kinds of customers is this utopian dream of trying to replicate the experience at a tourist attraction over the internet. Now, as much as that is potentially quite a nice romantic idea, the disadvantage in doing that is if you provide the whole experience of being at a tourist attraction over a browsing device, the situation that you might have is that actually you've got a lack of reason for a user to actually turn up to visit your attraction. So you're actually, cutting out some revenue there that you could be getting by having a bit of, some mystery around what the experience is like. Looking at the right-hand side there, looking at Black Friday, this is a big criticism I have of Black Friday. And actually, it's not just the end of December that we see this. So when we talk to organizations who are looking to deliver more functionality in terms of lead generation or e-commerce to try and push people over the edge and actually become customers, what we often find is that rather than actually delivering growth, what they're doing is pushing more customers faster towards a conversion point, which means that effectively what they're doing is converting out of their existing pipeline rather than looking at the reasons why they don't have larger awareness in the first place. So I'd suggest that if you are looking at growth, consider how that growth can be attained, and not to allow yourself to get stuck into moving quickly just because technology is telling you to do that. There are ways in which you can grow and also provide better experiences across multiple devices. And finally, 5 things that all briefs need. Timelines, and that's both for the responses and also for delivery of the services, so that organizations can work out whether they have actually got time to A, respond to your brief, and B, deliver the project within the timelines that you want. Some definition of the objectives is always really useful, because from our point of view, it really, really helps if we've got some understanding as to what the driver is, because ultimately the projects that have the clearer objectives, that have the bigger commercial impacts, will have more of our time associated to them, and that's because we think they're going to be more exciting to work on. A list of all the business systems involved is really useful. So digital transformation is used so widely at the moment that it can often mean to one organization looking at delivering data from all of their systems to create a better experience, but for others it can be that actually they just want maybe a CMS and a CRM to talk together more effectively and deliver better customer service, for example. So I think it's really important just to have a list of those systems involved and the ones that aren't, so it's nice and clear to us. Description of the users of the system would be useful. So we talked earlier on about persona generation. That is something that obviously we're seeing more clients trying to define as part of their process. So it doesn't need to be overly complicated like the example that we showed, but something that just in simple terms lays out who the customers are and what their pain points are and what the gain points are would be really useful to us. A budget's also very useful. Within responding to RFPs and to tenders, there's probably more time taken than is often reflected in the quality of documentation that you get back. But for suppliers who really, really, really want to win a piece of work, you're often looking at 1 to 2 weeks' work minimum to put together a response and an accurate estimate. And the good suppliers you'll be talking to will be saying to you, actually, we're really interested in doing this, but we need to know that there's some commercial cover behind doing this work, so that we're not expecting you to pay us for our time, but we need to know that it's a gamble worth taking. And equally, if you don't have a budget and you're talking internally to a team and they're artificially increasing the scope of the work outside of the budget that you've had, that causes you a problem down the line as well. So I think it's important for you to know what it is, and then in terms of sharing it, you don't necessarily need to share it with every single supplier, but for the suppliers who are really interested, it's a good idea to reassure them, not that you've got £93,250, but that you're in the right sort of ballpark for the kind of project they want to put forward to you as part of their proposal response. And that's the end of the presentation, so I'm going to pass you back over to Eddie for some questions.
Hi, John. That was great. Thank you very much and very insightful. But before we go into the questions, though, again, I just want to do a bit of a blatant promotion of our next webinar, which will be the first one of 2018, which is around 2018 digital trends. So please email Keith at itdigital.com to sign up for that. We did have a few questions, John, from the session. One was from David in the States, and he says, how long should writing a brief take?
So in terms of the length of time, it's as long as a piece of string, really. It depends on the complexity of the project. Typically, what I've seen is that clients tend to take around about 2 weeks to get the final brief together. And this webinar is really to try and get people to drop that down to around a week, because you shouldn't need much more than that. If you're agonizing for ages and ages about getting things down on paper and it's taking you more than 2 weeks, you're probably at the point where actually the business isn't yet agreed on what they wants to achieve, and it might mean that you need to have more meetings internally to be able to bottom that out. But I'd say normally, you know, around 2 weeks to get a brief together is the standard amount of time that people take, but you can cut it down to a week or maybe even less than that. I mean, I personally think you can get a brief done in a couple of days, so long as you concentrate on those 5 things that we put in our presentation earlier on.
And I guess if they're really struggling, John, they can always bring some agencies in to spark some inspirations, some ideas, and to help streamline that process.
Or they'd use our template as well that we've got on the next slide.
Very good. And we'll just go for this last question here, although we did have a few more which we included everyone as part of the follow-up questions after this. And this was from Patricia again in the States, and she asked, when is the best time of year to actually start a project?
So I think we said on the webinar live that often we see people trying to start projects now, and that in many ways is the worst time of year to start, because not only do you have the Christmas holidays, you've also got the 2-week period before Christmas where actually we can see clients starting to switch off from anything new. They're trying to get the projects that they've got over the line. So I personally think it's a good idea to start projects early in the year. So this webinar hasn't been planned completely in isolation of the time of year that we're in. It's always a good idea to start in January because it gives you a long time, regardless of the country that you're in, to really get your teeth into the strategic part of the discovery before you have any big breaks in terms of holidays and that sort of thing. So I'd normally start off in the early new year if I could. Or obviously, it does depend on the financial year that you run to. So a lot of our clients have financial years that run from April to March. So it completely depends on when the financial year is, but make sure that there's no massive disruptions. Not that it's just going to cause holiday delays, but also distract people away from thinking about the project strategically.
Perfect. Well, John, thanks a lot for that. As we did say in the live webinar as well, we do actually have a free bonus handout for anyone who's creating a project, and this is a kind of project plan template which helps people to navigate through the creation of the project and just outline clearly what it is you want to do. So we'll also include that as part of the follow-up email from the webinar as well. All that's left to do now is to thank everyone for a great 2017 and for taking part in all of these webinars that we've been doing, and we look forward to seeing you in 2018 as well. So happy Christmas, everyone, and thanks again.
Thanks a lot, guys, and Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.